All right, so the history lesson concludes, right? So now we're out of the history mode. I'm certainly willing to talk about that stuff, but I find it useful. Maybe you will find it useful. If you don't, then just chunk it. It's not necessary. But I hope you find it somewhat useful to have at least some historical reference markers for yourself. If you can glom onto any of that, right? If you thought, oh, that's how this fits in, or that's useful, great. If you don't, if that's not useful to you, chunk it, throw it out. It's not necessary. But I think it's useful to have, in some respects, a historical context for how Hegel became Hegel. I just gave you the kind of short shrift version of that, the 30, 40 longer minute version of how Hegel becomes Hegel, how Hegel emerges into what we call Hegel. So now I want to look at the prefaces to these two works, his first two major works of his corpus. The Phenomenology from 1807, that's when he's writing this in Jena famously. He's leaving because the Napoleon's troops are about to hit Jena, so famously he's leaving Jena in 1807 to go take a position as the head of a gymnasium, which is where he wrote the Science of Logic. So he was leading the curriculum for a bunch of boys in school at the gymnasium in Nuremberg, and he's writing the Science of Logic basically on his free time. Right? So this 800-page work gets written there. By the time he's finished with it, he gets called to go to Heidelberg, so that's the kind of progression in his own career, and that's where his first professorship would be, was in Heidelberg, and then eventually he went from there to Berlin, right, which is where he's famously finished out his career, and really published the Encyclopedia in 1817, the first edition. He publishes that as he's leaving Heidelberg, and then he revises it twice in Berlin, 1827 and 1830, and then he also publishes in 1821 the Philosophy of Writing. But that's the career, right? That's his writings. Those are his major writings. All of those books, as I said, point either towards, you're going to see where the Phenomenology in its preface points you toward the logic. He hadn't written it yet, but he was anticipating it. And then all those other books point you back to it. If you want to know in more detail what's going on here, go see my logic. So hence the claim that it's... All right, so let's take a look at the preface to the Phenomenology, the preface to the Science of Logic. The preface to the Phenomenology was written, as I just mentioned, 1807. The preface to the the Science of Logic was written, this is like he's finished the first volume, so it's publishing just the first volume. He hadn't finished the whole work yet. He's just finishing the first volume in 1812. Right? So they're 5 years apart. Really written about 5 years apart. Let's talk a little bit about prefaces, though, because it's important. It starts off each one of them by telling you prefaces are crap. I'm paraphrasing, but that's literally what he's saying. That's because they're not systematic works. He doesn't argue in prefaces. Well, he doesn't give systematic argument. He states a lot of things in a polemical fashion. This is where he thinks prefaces have a role to play. They're polemics. They're where you battle with your adversaries. There's where you call out other people. But you don't demonstrate anything. You just say things without giving the actual warrant for those claims. So they're polemical, a bit dogmatic, frankly. And he's warning you about taking anything out of a preface and saying, aha, here's where Hegel makes this claim and here's where he justifies it. No such thing ever happens in a preface, according to Hegel. So I separate what I call the systematic function of reason from the extra systematic function of reason. Prefaces, he also did this in his occasional essays that he wrote over his career as well. Those are extra systematic. He's not trying to demonstrate, justify, provide argumentation in the systematic sense for any of those claims he's making there. He makes claims all over the place, right, in those pieces, but he's not trying to justify any of those things. So that comes then with the warning. That's what he's doing at the beginning of each one of those prefaces. He's telling you, I'm not arguing. So what you're about to see is I'm going to give you some help, what prefaces are needed to do. I'm going to give you some help to get into what we're going to do in the actual argumentation and the systematic presentation of the material. But I'm not arguing for that stuff here. So I'm trying to give you a leg up, what he'll call in the Phenomenology, the preface of Phenomenology, a ladder into these discussions. But the ladder is not the systematic argumentation itself. So then what is the purpose of prefaces? Take a look at what he says in the beginning of the preface to the Phenomenology. This is on page, I think it's on the very first page of the Phenomenology preface. So if you take a look on the side, those are the the critical edition pagination. The critical edition pagination is on page 9. It's page 3 of the Cambridge translation. Everybody see on that? It's page 9 on the side, right next to preface. He says right up front, in the preface to a philosophical work, it is customary, this is what's expected, it's what's standardly received, what we ought to be doing, for the author to give an explanation, namely an explanation of its purpose in writing the book, the motivations behind it, and relations it bears to other previous or contemporary treatments of the same topics. He's about to do that. Okay? So he's going to do what's customarily expected of a preface. But then notice what he says. But for a philosophical work, this seems not only superfluous, there's the crap, right? You don't really need this. But in light of the nature of the subject matter, that's the nature of the Sache selbst, the matter itself, the subject matter. It seems even inappropriate and counterproductive. There's the warning. First line of the preface is, I'm going to do it, but it's dangerous. Why? Because it looks like it's counterproductive. It's inappropriate. Why? Because the matter itself is not really going to be addressed here. Why not? What he says. For whatever it might be suitable to say about philosophy in a preface, for instance, to give some historical instruction about the biases and standpoint of the text, or some talk about the general content and the results together with a set of scattered assertions and assurances about the truth, all of which he's about to do, by the way, in this preface and in the next one, in all of his prefaces. He says, none of these can count as the way to present philosophical truth. I suggest you hold on to them, because you're about to see a lot of assertions from Hegel about his own thought, about the thought of others. He's at least going to allude to them. And none of it is meant as a demonstration. You're not supposed to take it and go, oh, okay, you've shown me, you've made an argument. He hasn't. He's telling you it's inappropriate to the way you present philosophical truth. Your question ought to be at that point, well then, okay, how are you supposed to present philosophical truth? Glad you asked. It comes in paragraph 76 or whatever in the preface, where he says, oh, that's in the logic. The logic is an 800-page text on metaphysics. Yeah, and included in that metaphysics, strangely at the end of it, is its methodology, for reasons we'll get to. Now, he says in the introduction, in the preface to the Science of Logic, something quite similar, a little more concisely. Take a look here with me on this is on page. Preface to the first edition. This is on page. Go all the way over to. Where is that? Oh, he says it in the introduction. Sorry. So I didn't assign this for you to read, so you not worry about that. Not yet. We'll read it for next week. Take a look on page 23 in the translation. This is page. Yes, let's do page 23 for right now. He writes there this. Sorry. Yeah, he says, first lines again here. He says, in no science is the need to begin with the fact, the Sache itself, right? The Sache itself. Without preliminary reflections. He's about to give you a preliminary reflection in the introduction and also in the preface. Felt more strongly than in the science of logic. In every other science, the matter that it treats, the Sache that it's about, and the scientific method are distinguished from each other. They're separate from each other. You apply the method to the subject matter under investigation. Not here, he says. The content, moreover, does not make an absolute beginning, but is dependent on other concepts and is connected on all sides with other material. It is therefore permitted to these sciences to speak of their ground and its context as well as of their method in the form of lemmas. Premises taken for granted. Not so here. You can't take anything for granted here. It is therefore permitted to these sciences to speak of their ground and its context as well as of their method in the form of lemmas. To apply presupposed forms of definitions and the like without further ado is known and accepted, and to make use of customary ways of argumentation in order to establish their general concepts and fundamental determinations. Okay. Can't do that here? No. Why not? Because we must be committed to not presupposing a thing. Well then, what are these prefaces and introductions all about? These prefaces and introductions are to help us into the science itself, to get a hold on something with which we might have some familiarity before we dive deep into the matter itself and let it move us, let us follow in. So what is the purpose of prefaces, this extra systematic forms of argument? It's what Hegel calls Bildung, formation, to move us into the place we need to be to think about the matter itself. And we do that with crutches. The crutches are comparisons with other people's thought and how we differentiate ourselves from those and give us initial formulations of those things. And he also, in the prefaces and introductions, will refer to historical preconditions of this stuff. Nowhere in the actual body of the system does he do that. It's only here. But he says very clearly, take a look now back at the phenomenology, sorry to go back and forth, but take a look back at the phenomenology's preface. He talks about what he calls there in paragraph 7. This paragraph 7 is on pages 15 and 16 in the translation, page 12 in the critical edition. He says this is on in paragraph 7. It says this. This is on the top of page 7, 3 lines down to the top of page 7. Not only has its essential life been lost to it, what's he talking about? Its essential life. We'll come back to that. But look at what he says. It is conscious of this and of the finitude that is its content, turning itself away from such leftover dregs, spirit, while both confessing to being mired in wickedness and reviling itself for being so, now demands from philosophy not knowledge of what spirit is, rather it demands that it again attain the substantiality and the solidity of what is. And it is through philosophy that it attains this, the solidity and substantiality of what is. He calls this in paragraph 11, at the bottom of page 8. Besides, he says, last 2 lines on page 8, it is not difficult to see that our epoch is a time of birth. We live in a new world, he's saying. The time has come to do what needs to be done. And a transition to a new period. So here's a kind of historical precondition. We live at a time right for a system. Spirit has broken with the previous world of its existence and its ways of thinking. It is now of a mind to let them recede into the past and to immerse itself in its own work as reshaping, reforming itself. Take a look at now paragraph 12. Middle of that paragraph is right in the middle of page 9. He says, yet this newness, this new world in which we're living, is more completely actual than is the newborn child. So it's not finished, it's not done. We have work to do here. Time is right doesn't mean we've actually paid off on that. It means we've got the chance, we've got the opportunity. And it's essential to bear this in mind. Its immediacy, or its concept, is the first to come on the scene. However, just as little of a building is finished when its foundation has been laid. You haven't done the building just because you laid the foundation. That's all we've got at this point. So too, reaching the concept of the whole is equally as little as the whole itself. When we wish to see an oak with its powerful trunk and spreading branches and its massive foliage, we are not satisfied if instead we are shown an acorn. So this is a famous metaphor, comes all the way back in versions of Aristotle. But he's saying, in the same way, following on this acorn, it's not enough to see the acorn to get the whole tree, you need that whole tree. In the same way, science, by science he means, the term is Wissenschaft, so he means philosophical knowledge, justified true belief. He doesn't mean natural science or natural science alone. He means knowledge is actually true. Science, the crowning glory of a spiritual world, is not completed in its initial stages. The beginning of a new spirit is the outcome of a widespread revolution in the diversity of forms of cultural formation, cultural building, which you see at the bottom. It is both the prize at the end of a winding path, just as it is the prize won through such struggle and effort. We're not there yet at this point, right? We're at a point where that becomes possible, but we're not yet there at the completion of that. We have work to do. It is the whole which has returned into itself from out of its succession and extension and has come to be the simple concept of itself. The actuality of this simple whole consists of those embodiments which, having become moments of the whole, again develop themselves anew and give themselves a figuration. But this time in their new element, in the new meaning which itself has come to be. So there's the beginning of that usage of the notion of element. We'll come back to that in just a moment. Now he's going to say in the preface to the first edition of the Science of Logic. Now we can come back over to this passage. Take a look. I'm on page 7. In the first lines of the preface here. Notice what he does. The complete transformation that the ways of philosophical thought have undergone amongst us in the past 25 odd years. Here's your, back in 1787, something started going. So there's been a transformation at work. We're living in the wake of this new world that's initiated. More about that, but at least that's initiated. So he's already saying, I'm living in the heritage, in the lineage of Kant, the critical philosophy. He says, the higher standpoint in self-awareness that spirit has attained in this period of time, so he's saying, we live in a momentous age. It affords us some possibilities. But then he says, has so far had, here's the kicker, little influence on the shape of logic. That's why he's writing the logic. We don't yet have a logic that's been informed by the new world in which we live. What is that new world? Well, more about that, but the historical precondition is at least the advent of Kantian philosophy, the advent of the critical philosophy. Here's where he's signaling, I'm a Kantian. He's a post-Kantian, we'll see, but he's a Kantian. I live in the wake of it. Now, there's a lot of questions already we could have, like, if we're not supposed to be presupposing anything, how can we have historical preconditions? What's the difference between a precondition and a presupposition? Something we want to think about quite a bit. Because Hegel's clearly saying that science itself has got to be presuppositionless. You cannot assume anything. Nothing, literally nothing, can be taken for granted. That's the condition of doing scientific, systematic, philosophical thought.
How can it be a complete transformation if it hasn't had any influence or little influence?
On logic. It's had much influence on other things.
But not on logic.
Not on logic.
Little on.
Yeah, we'll see what he means by that in just a moment. But for the moment, yes, that's right. It's had impact. It's had transformation, but not on logic. So at that point, we want to think about, well, what does it mean to have a historical precondition like this, the Kantian philosophy? And as we're about to see, there's more than just the Kantian philosophy being alluded to there. How can that be a precondition of a presuppositionalist science? We need to think about that, right? That's one of the standard controversial points in Hegel, is he demands us to be presuppositionalists, and yet there's preconditions that he acknowledges. That's what he just did for what he's doing. But notice where they're placed. They're placed in the preface. They'll be in the introduction as well. They'll never show up in the system itself because he doesn't think that they can stand in the system. They're here because we need them. They're the crutches that we need. The historical reference markers are not integral to the system itself. So a precondition is not a presupposition because you don't have to have them in place in order for something to happen. They're the historical references that can help you understand what's to be done. Now, what does it mean then to say the time has come? That's roughly what all those passages together are saying. The time has come. We live in a new world. We live at this momentous moment where we can actually begin to think about what all this stuff might mean for philosophy and what it all might mean for logic in particular. What does it mean to say that the time has come for the raising of philosophy into science? He says famously in the preface, right, for ever since it started, philosophy strove after truth. It's the striving after truth. It's the love of wisdom. Philosophia. It's the love of wisdom. Hegel famously says, yeah, it needs to stop being that. It needs to just be freaking wisdom. It's loved it for long enough. It's chased. That amorous journey needs to end. We need to actually have it, grasp it, know it as it is, in and for itself. Now, remember, right? Kant told us can't have it ever elusive in itself, not for you. Humans can't know it. God maybe, but we're not God. So us, all we can do is have before us the phenomenon. So calm down. This is my short version of Kant. Calm down. All you can have is knowledge of the phenomenon. It's really great knowledge you can have about it, empirical knowledge about it, metaphysical knowledge about it, but you can't know the end itself. Hegel, he's not alone, but Hegel thinks that's a trick. That's telling you, you can have enough and you ought to be satisfied. You can't have the Tower of Babel, you can only have the house fitted for the plane of experience. And Hegel's going to say, not good enough. Philosophy's not satisfied. That's still love of wisdom. That's not wisdom itself. That's not science. That's not actual knowledge, justified knowledge. That's what we demand. That's what we want. That's what Hegel thinks we can actually have. That's what absolute knowing is. It's knowledge of, the absolute, the in itself, the unconditioned. All right. He's writing the preface to the Phenomenology, right? So how are we going to do that? Well, that's what the job of the Phenomenology is, to show us that we can have that. But he gives you some preliminary formulations of what it is, what the absolute is. Even here, here's the crutches, right? Here's the ladders. It's going to help you to move into that position. So he says we need to think about this new element. You just saw it in paragraph 12 in the preface to the Phenomenology. He calls it this time in their new element. What is that new element? Well, in paragraph 17 through 26, right? So in that section of the preface, he gives you three names for that new element. He calls it a concept, he calls it the ether, and he calls it the element itself. So he repeats the term. So take a look at, these are famous passages that are worth calling to mind. Take a look at paragraph 17. This is on page 12, 18 of the critical. He writes this: in my view, this is the very first lines of paragraph 17 of the preface to the Phenomenology. In my view, which must be justified by the exposition of the system itself. There he is telling you, look, I'm not giving you a justification for this. Nowhere in this preface will you find that. I'm just going to assert it. So I'm saying something without warrant. If this is all he ever said about it, it would be dogmatic. So he's giving you a dogmatic initial formulation. In my view, which must be justified by the exposition of the system itself, everything hangs on. Well, you ought to perk up your ears when somebody says that, philosophy particularly. Everything, they mean that. Not most things, some things, really important things. No, everything, literally all things. Hang on, grasping and expressing the truth. Okay, that's what we're after. We want to know the truth. We want to know how the nature of reality itself. We want to know the truth. He says, not just as substance, but just as much as subject. Thank you. That cleared everything up. No. What does that tell you? Well, substance sounds like Aristotle, right? So, okay, Aristotle was right. Everything is substance. Okay, fine. But not just as substance, so not just Aristotle, but just as much as subject. Okay. How's that supposed to work? How's the thing supposed to be both substance and subject? Subject sounds like, Kant and Fichte. So now we've got Aristotle, Kant, and Fichte supposed to be wed together and so on. That looks like the references. But does that tell you a lot? Frankly, no. It just says whatever the absolute is, whatever the true itself is, it's substance thought of as subjectivity. Substance, like Aristotle said, but also like Spinoza said. There's no subject in Spinoza's absolute. Okay, well, it's not just that, it's also subjectivity. Okay, how's that supposed to work? Well, it sounds like he's trying to combine substantiality, something that has the weightedness to it, with something that has activity. That's what subjectivity means in both Kant and Fichte. Subjects are not knowers of the world, they are creators. Different ways, but they are creators of the world, certainly in Fichte, and in a different way in Kant as well. So that's at least initially what that means. And then he says this, and that's this is the next paragraph down. Paragraph 18, so the last 7 lines of that on that page. As subject, everybody see where I'm at? As subject. So here's, you're asking Hegel, he's just told you the true is substance, not only substance, but subject as well. What do you mean by subject? Look at what he says about it. As subject, it is pure, simple negativity. Okay, this, from everything I've said so far, you should know that's probably important because he's ascribing negativity, negation, to subjectivity itself. What that means, who knows? He doesn't tell you. That's at least what it looks like. And he says, as a result, it is the estrangement of what is simple, the othering, literally, of what is simple. So the differentiation of something from itself. That's what he means by negativity. Something becoming other. Or, he's just trying out different formulations. Or, it is the doubling which posits oppositions. The doubling, right? The differing. Which posits, puts in place oppositions, like God and world, soul, body, things like that. And which is, again, the negation of this indifferent diversity and its opposition. If you count up, there's 2 negations there. There's a negation that separates, there's a negation that brings them back together in some kind of way. That's weird. Negation doesn't do that. I mean, we all know what negation does. Negation separates. I am not you. Right? This is not me. That's negation. That's separation. Well, he's saying, well, yeah, but negation isn't just that separation, that becoming other. It's a becoming other, whereby that becoming other actually becomes what something is. It comes into its own. That is, so here we go, more formulations of the same damn thing. It is only the self-restoring sameness. Negation is a self-restoring sameness. It's not only the opposing, but it's a self-restoring sameness. The reflected turned into itself in its otherness. The reflected returning into itself in, not out of, not over against, but in its otherness. Somehow or another, I'm not you, and now it's a we. That's weird. How'd that work? The true is not an original unity as such. I'm not hurtling. The true being is not an original unity as such, not being as such. Or not an immediate unity as such, which is what he thought both Hölderlin, what he knew, both Hölderlin and Schelling thought it was. It is the coming to be of itself, the circle that presupposes its end as its goal and has its end for its beginning, which is actual only through this accomplishment and its end. It is nothing other than that production of itself. Now, this is a preface again, right? It's an extra systematic presentation of this material. He doesn't argue for that claim. He's giving you formulations of what this new element is, what this new matter itself that we're trying to think really is, what the nature of reality is. But notice here, he's very careful to say, this is something that is happening, not something that we're doing. It's something that's occurring. It's never volitional language. It's not, we come upon something, we differentiate ourselves from it, and then we figure out, oh crap, we need to reconcile ourselves with that thing, so we need to restore ourselves to it. That's dialectical movement, right? That's what he's just laid out. That's dialectical movement. That's what he's going to call the dialectic. But notice what it's not. It's not an operation of the mind. Or better said, it's not an operation of the mind alone. What he's just talked about is something that goes on in the nature of reality itself, whether we do it to it or not. This is what it does of itself. So the nature of reality is substance conceived as subject. Take a look at paragraph 25. I'm just skipping through here. There's a lot of stuff we can go back to, but there's just picking out some things that I think are particularly useful. So he said the concept is this movement of substance and subject, right? It is that process. That's what he's already given us. But now he wants to say in 25, the concept is this thing he calls the in itself, the for itself, and the in and for itself. So he says here famously, that the true is only actual as a system, or that substance is essentially subject, is expressed in the representation that expresses the absolute as spirit. So this is just him just sort of picking up all these crutches he's giving you and saying, look, here's one more term for it, spirit. I'm about to write a whole book about this, obviously, but spirit is my name for that process that I've already been talking about in terms of substance and subject, in terms of this process. He says, the most sublime concept is one which belongs to modernity and its religion. This is why he calls it this in this book, but it's not in the science of logic. We'll talk about that. The spiritual alone is the actual, it is the essence or what exists in itself. It is what is self-comporting or the determinate itself or the otherness and the being for itself. So it's both the in itself. Kant told us we couldn't know that. Hegel's saying that's where we start, always with the in itself. That becomes for itself, for us particularly, but becomes other than itself, for itself. And then it becomes what it fully is, becomes in and for itself, as he says. And in this determinateness, to be the self-enduring, in this being external to itself, or it is in and for itself, thank you. Right? I mean, all these are just stabs. None of them are systematically demonstrated. They're stabs that are articulating, formulating what the absolute is, what the true is, what this new element that we live in is. And then, importantly, I think in paragraph 26, I had a mentor one time, whenever you asked him, what does Hegel mean by spirit? He would always quote this passage, right? Because it was his favorite passage about sort of saying in a nutshell, what does Hegel think about it? I think there's a lot to that, but kind of misses some of the other aspects of it, but it's another formulation that will work this way. So look at the very beginning of paragraph 26. Pure self-knowing and absolute otherness. Pure self-knowing and absolute otherness. That's the short version of what spirit is. Pure self-knowing and absolute otherness. Then he calls it this ether as such. He's calling it an ether. That's a term directly taken from Hölderlin. Hölderlin wrote poems after poems after poems to father ether. And what he meant by father ether was a poetic symbolic representation of, he was taking this from the science of the day, Lavoisier, Kant has it as well. Kant has it in the Opus Posthumus, he talks about the ether proofs all the time. The ether is that which makes possible the connectedness of all things. It's that element in which we live and breathe. In natural science, it was the ability to, how you can explain motion at a distance, because we're actually connected through the ether. Well, Hölderlin picks up on that and says, yeah, but that's really the name, that's a scientific version of it. But poetically, symbolically, let's call it father ether, because that's the being that subtends everything that is. It's that in which we dwell. Like fish in water, we are in the ether. So Hegel picks up on that term and says, I like that. That's good. I don't agree with Hölderlin where he goes with that, but I like that fundamentality of that. So he says, pure self-knowing and absolute otherness, this ether as such is the very ground and soil of science, philosophical science, or knowing in its universality. The beginning of philosophy presupposes or demands that consciousness is situated in this element. However, this element itself has its culmination and its transparency only through the movement of its coming to be. There's your conundrum, right? It demands that we be in the element, but we don't know what the element is until the system has actually been constructed. That seems like a problem, right? And Hegel acknowledges this problem. Look at the last line on page 16. For its part, he famously says, science requires that self-consciousness shall have elevated itself, brought itself up to what? Into this ether. You got to dwell in this ether. I thought we already dwelled in it. I thought it was already here. It is, but we have to make ourselves aware of it. Does that work? In order to be able to live with science and to live in science, to be able to do philosophy. Now, Hölderlin and Schelling's answer to that question, how do you know the ether, is intellectual intuition. If you have it, good for you. If you don't, bad for you. You can't do philosophy. Literally, I mean, Schelling famously said, this is in the lectures on theology, Schelling famously says, to do philosophy is you must do intellectual intuition. If you don't have intellectual intuition, you can't grasp the nature of reality. If that's just something outside your purview, you can't do philosophy. Sorry for you. All the elitism born into that, Schelling was comfortable with that. He didn't think philosophy was for everybody. Everybody can't see the nature of reality. Hegel rejects that. So he says, there's got to be a way of getting you to the ether, not through the demand that you have intellectual intuition. So what does he say? He says this. Into this ether, you have to be elevated into this ether in order to be able to live with science and to live in science, to be able to do philosophy. And for that matter, to be able to live at all. So it's not just nothing. Conversely, the individual has the right to demand that science, philosophy, philosophical science, provide him at least with the ladder to reach this standpoint. So here's the famous ladder. He's about to tell you the phenomenology is that ladder. Phenomenology is supposed to move you from ordinary consciousness into philosophical consciousness. It takes 400 pages, but that's what it does. It does that by exhaustively looking through all the ways in which we can know things and what entails and how that entails the next form of knowing we can have. All these what he calls standards of truth and how they transform into the next standard of truth and how that all ultimately ends up in knowing the absolute as it is in itself. So that's going to be what he's going to charge the phenomenology with. Now he's going to come back to the same issue because he always worries about this. He's always concerned, unlike Schelling. Schelling just says either you have intellectual intuition or you don't. Hölderlin seems to say the same thing. He says it poetically. Hegel wants to say philosophy owes you an account of how you could come to have this kind of insight. So it ought to be able to bring you from ordinary consciousness into proper philosophical, systematic consciousness. So he's always, in prefaces and introductions, almost obsessed with this question of how do we enter into the element? The element is substance, subject, self-consciousness and absolute otherness. That's the element. That's the movement of the dialectic. But how do we get into that? He knows our ordinary consciousness is not there. And yet we dwell already, we're already in. This element, how do we not know it? How do we become aware of it? That's the question. That we have to provide an account for. The phenomenology is an attempt to address that question. The phenomenology is his attempt to answer the Kantian charge that we can't know the end itself. He thinks he's going to take on that charge that you've got to demonstrate what you know. He's going to take on the question of the quid juris, Hegel is, and say, by what right do you know these things? And he thinks the phenomenology is a demonstration that we have the right to know things as they are in themselves. Kant was wrong. We can know things as they are in themselves. Now, if he's right about that, then where do you go from there? You lay out the structure of the nature of reality. You write the science of logic. So in paragraphs 26 through 37 in the Preface of Phenomenology, he tells you this process is the ladder, the ascent, or the elevation, is what the phenomenology is trying to accomplish. And he calls it there, this is in paragraphs later, in paragraph 37, 38, he says that's why the phenomenology is the transition into the logic. So now you go, oh crap. You mean I can't actually read the logic without having read the phenomenology? That's what it looks like he's just told you. And it is what he just said. It is what he just said. But it's not the only thing he thinks. It's not the only pathway into the system, the only pathway into the science. He thinks the phenomenology is a pathway, but it's not the only pathway. And that's why he comes back and retreats this issue, as we'll see, in the science of logic itself. It's there in the introduction, which we'll read for next week. It's there in with what must science begin, because he's consumed by this, okay, how do we elevate ordinary consciousness into philosophical consciousness? Because we can't do anything in the logic proper until we address that question. Make some sense? And let me just pick a couple of things before I turn to the preface of the logic itself. Look at what he says in paragraph 47. So this is about philosophical truth and its method. He says in paragraph 47, philosophy on the other hand, so this is that, yeah. In contrast, philosophy does not study. Everybody see where I'm at right at the beginning, paragraph 47 on page 28. In contrast, so he's contrasting, this is political nature, right? Philosophy doesn't do this kind of crap like other things do. Philosophy, on the other hand, considers not the inessential determination, but the determination so far as it is essential. Philosophy is about the necessity, essential nature. Not the abstract or inactual is its element and content, but the actual. So it's not how things ought to be, it's not how things might seem to be, it's how they actually are. This would be one of the central questions. How do we elaborate how things actually are when the elaboration doesn't look like anything that is? They seem to be in contradiction or not. That which posits itself and lives in itself, existence in its concept. They're using that weird sense of concept, in its concept. Sounds like in its element, in its ether. He means them all the same way. He thinks they're all the same thing. Concept, ether, element, they're all the same thing. They're all this movement, this process of othering of itself, and thereby coming to be itself. He says there in paragraph 47 famously, it's on the second line down from the top of 29, the truth is thus the bacchanalian frenzy, the revel, the whirl, the tumult, in which no member is not drunk, and because each, as soon as it detaches itself, dissolves itself immediately, the frenzy, the revel, the whirl is just as much transparent and simple peace. It's also the peace. So it's the frenzy, it's also the peace. It's differentiation, in which everything is drunk. It's bacchanalian revel. It's also the peace that arises out of that. Very strange image, right? But he's trying to give you crutches, right? To get into what do we mean by this process of the element that we live in. Then look at what he says in 48. It might seem necessary to state at the outset the principal points concerning the method of this movement. Be helpful. Let's get it down now. Let's go ahead and lay out the method. Or the method of science. However, its concept lies in what has already been said. There's your disappointment, right? I've already told you what it is. Where did you do that? Well, this self-othering thing, that's the methodology. Why? Because strictly speaking, Hegel doesn't have a method. So here's my little polemic, right, of my own. Hegel actually doesn't have a method. We like to tell ourselves that there's something called the dialectical method. This is the polemical thing. We like to think of ourselves as saying, see, Hegel is a dialectical thinker. and other people are dialectical thinkers. And what that means is they think of in dialectical terms. And what that means is, in its most pernicious version, that they think in terms of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That is literally nowhere in Hegel. It's in Fichte, but it's not in Hegel. Because Hegel's not a dialectical thinker. If what you mean by a dialectical thinker is he had a dialectical method and he, pardon the way of putting these things, dialecticizes things. Hegel will tell you repeatedly, our job as philosophers is basically the following: to immerse ourselves in the nature of the matter itself and observe. That's the methodology. Now, it will turn out that what we observe has this process that we just talked about at work, this negation that negates itself, right? This determinate negation stuff. But we don't go in and impose that on stuff. We don't go in and push that, oh, here's a thesis, here's the antithesis, here's a... No. Triplicity, no. What we do is we see what the matter demands, and we observe what it entails, immanently, without imposing anything on it. So when we try to think being, we're necessarily and immanently compelled to think nothing, because pure being is vacuous. It is nothing. And yet nothing is. So nothing, to use a later terminology, exists. Strangely, nothing is, it exists. Well, how can those be thought together? The name for that is becoming. But that's not something we put on those things. That's something that's demanded by the matter itself. All we've got to do, it's a lot to this, is acknowledge that process, that movement, and name it appropriately to its depth. So he says, it might seem necessary to devote a lengthy preamble to the method of this movement or of science, but the concept of this method is implicit in what he said, and its real exposition belongs to the logic. You won't find it here in the Phenomenology and the Preface and Introduction, anywhere else. It belongs to logic. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, it's at the very end of that 800-page book we're about to read. That's where the methodology is elaborated. Or rather, he says, it constitutes the logic. Well, that's what you're going to find out in the logic too, because what he's going to say in those final few pages on methodology in the science of logic, sorry to spoil, here's a spoiler alert, here's a spoil the ending, is everything we've just gone through, yeah, that's the methodology. Because the methodology is just the content. There's no form separable from it. Everyone who ever reads the book is terribly disappointed by it. Right? Why? Because that's telling you that the stuff you just had to work yourself through and you sweat, blood, and tears over is actually nothing other than this process that is the movement of all things, and that's the method of all things. The method's intrinsic, endemic to things, not something you impose upon it. Very different way of thinking about methodology than we stand think about. So then he says in, so we'll go over quite a ways here. I'm sorry for the big leap here, but it's useful. Paragraph 71, this is on page 45. He says, 4 lines down from the top of page 45, 49 in the critical. I can thereby also hope that this attempt to vindicate science's right to the concept and to expound science into this, its own distinct development, will know how to force its way through the crowd by way of the inner truth of what is at stake. So the matter will win out itself, right? You won't need the polemics, which I'm giving you here. You won't need all this crutches. The matter will win out for itself. We must hold on to the conviction that it is the nature of truth to prevail when its time has come. So there's that, the time has arrived. We live in this new age. And that it only appears when its time has come, and that it thus never appears too early, nor does it appear for a public not yet ripe enough to receive it. We have to, that's convictions we have to have. Otherwise, why do this? We must also hold on to the conviction that the individual requires this effect in order to confirm for himself what is yet for him still only his own solitary affair, in order for him to experience as universal what is initially only something particular to him. That is to say, I think I grasped it. Does everyone get it like this? Is what everyone thinks about this? Prove it out through demonstration, through argumentation, rather than just my private beliefs. Now with that, he's told you what he's trying to do in the Phenomenology. Take a look at what he does in the preface to the first edition of the Science of Love. So I'll slow us down and go more step by step. Have I lost anyone? We okay? I mean, all that's crazy. Let me stipulate that. All that's not so crazy. You've got a lot of work to do. None of that has been justified. So you shouldn't go, oh, that's all true. You should go, oh, those are formulations that are supposed to help me get where I'm supposed to be. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Hegel's fine with that. That's what prefaces do. They try to help you. They may not be successful. Go back to this opening line in the preface to the first edition, Science of Logic. The complete transformation that the ways of philosophical thought have undergone among us in the past 25 odd years, the higher standpoint and self-awareness that spirit has attained in this period of time, has so far had little influence on the shape of the logic. So that's the things have happened, but they haven't happened in logic. And you can anticipate, right? That's why we need to write this book. Right? 800 pages worth of writing spawned out of this, at least the historical precondition for it. Now, what is he talking about in that first line, complete transformation? Well, as I already said, he's clearly alluding to the date, the year 1787. That's 25 years before this. If we take the reference strictly. Maybe it's off. But 1787 seems relevant. So that's important because, as we discussed earlier, that little historical sketch I gave you, that's important because he's referencing then the real beginning of the impact of Kant's work. So he's signaling that's been an important, monumental part of what's gone on in our intellectual development. So we need to reference it. It's a landmark. It's a landmark that we haven't paid off on yet. So that standard kind of post-Kantian view, Kant was right, but the system can't be, the project can't be completed that way. Same thing going on in Hegel, right? Hegel's saying, we start from Kant, right? We are Kantians, but we can't end as Kantians. There's something more that's necessary. And he's saying, we haven't really seen what the Kantian philosophy, the critical philosophy, means for the logic. Let's get to it. Look what he says. So the critical philosophy is one of the historical preconditions, prerequisites upon which the present work builds. But then he talks about the higher standpoint. See that next line, the higher standpoint? What's that? The higher standpoint of in self-awareness that spirit has attained in this period of time? I don't think he's just repeating himself there. I don't think he's just saying Kant and then Kant again. I think he's saying Kant in the first one, 25 odd years. But that higher standpoint, with that phrase, Hegel appears to me to be alluding to the various social and cultural upheavals and shifts that all came to a head in Europe at the beginning of the 19th century. The dawn of a new age, a new epoch in the life of humanity. What he called, as we saw back in paragraph 11 in the Phenomenology of Spirit, a time of birth and transition to a new era. So he's picking up on that saying, we live in a momentous time. So he's referring to the fact that human beings have come to understand freedom, this is the self-awareness one, freedom, that is autonomy, self-determination, as the very essence of humanity. Thank you, Kant. Thank you, Schiller. Thank you, lots of others. But also the very nature of reality itself. That last bit's not Kant, not Schiller, but he thinks it's an implication of it. So the social and political upheaval he's talking about is the recognition the only proper ground of political authority is freedom, right? The governance of its citizens. That's the French Revolution. The cultural revolution he's talking about happens in art and in religion. Art, it's the birth of modernism, the Romantics, and it's the birth, going all the way back to the Reformation, the magisterial Reformation, to the recognition that faith is a matter of something I have to be invested in. So in humans seeing freedom as their essence, freedom and autonomy I'm using interchangeably here, reason has progressed beyond merely being the criterion and tribunal of truth and goodness to being itself the author of the laws of thought and conduct. This is the real shift that Kant, modernism, and painting, cultural movements are all seeing as well. But what is that higher standpoint? Well, he's already told you. The higher standpoint means that you have to think of autonomy. How? Self-relation in and through others. That's what autonomy is. Self-relation in and through others. In sum, then, a philosophical, social, cultural, political revolution stands as the historical space that makes possible the insight into the determinations of thought, of what it is to think. That's what a logic minimally is, what it is to think. And so Hegel's telling you, we haven't seen the payoff of those yet in what it means to think. So Hegel's central claim here is that these momentous historical advancements have, at least as of yet, had little effect on what he calls the gestalt, the shape of logic itself. In fact, the only place they've been seen so far, the only place they've been made aware of them so far, is in metaphysics. So now he reminds us, right, what happens to metaphysics as a result of these momentous transformations? He tells you now, look in the next paragraph down. What has hitherto called metaphysics has been, so to speak, extirpated root and branch, and has vanished from the ranks of the sciences. So for all of Kant's telling us, look, I'm trying to lay out a critical metaphysics, the message was, can't do metaphysics. Metaphysics is dead in the water. All you can do is critique. Critique, we mean we can lay out the conditions of the possibility of experience, but you can't make any positive claims about what the metaphysical structure of experience itself would be. Now, again, read the first critique, read any of Kant's works. He's telling you that's not true. He's telling you repeatedly, I can lay out a critical metaphysics. We can do synthetic a priori judgments. They're just not as grandiose as they used to be. Right? They're not God exists. There are things like things are spatial and temporal and categorical. But he says, where are the voices, Hegel, where are the voices still to be heard of the ontology of former times? This is all metaphysics, right? Ontology, being as such. Of the rational psychology, what's the nature of the soul, the human soul? The cosmology, what's the nature of the world? Or indeed, even of the natural theology, God of the past. There's God, freedom, and immortality, if you put it in those terms. Where is that? It seems like that's all dead. Or where are they allowed to be heard? Where are they allowed, right? Where are they permitted? When they violate the Kantian strictures, if they said anything. That's what it's like what happened. Inquiries, for instance, into the immateriality of the soul, into mechanical and final causes, where is interest in them still to be found? Even the former proofs of God's existence are cited only out of historical interests. We don't even talk about those anymore. Why? Because Kant showed us none of those work. Or for the purpose of edification and the uplifting of the mind. The fact is that interest, whether in the content or in the form of metaphysics or in both together, has been lost. Metaphysics, over. That's what he's telling you. So the effect of that complete upheaval that Kant and the French Revolution and the social and cultural revolution had, the impact of that, very clear in metaphysics. Extirpated, decimated, not to be done. Remarkable as it is if a people has become indifferent, for instance, to its constitutional law, to its convictions, its moral customs and virtues, that's a kind of reference back to creeping of nihilism. He says, so that's remarkable, right? Jacobi was all upset about that. But just as remarkable as that is this. Just as remarkable is it when a people loses its metaphysics. And that's Hegel telling you, we need a metaphysics. We need a metaphysics that grows out of that revolution. So we need, to put it in terms I used earlier, a post-critical metaphysics, one that has learned the lesson of critique, addressed the demand of the quid juris of critique, and can give us the nature of reality. When the spirit engaged with its pure essence no longer has any real presence in its life. That's a reference to the Eucharist. Now look at what he does, very explicitly now, in the last paragraph on page 7. The exoteric teaching of the Kantian philosophy. You ought to stop. Anytime somebody tells you there's an exoteric teaching, there's an esoteric teaching, right? So there's an exoteric, what everybody can see, but there's a hidden teaching as well. So we all know what the Kantian exoteric teaching is, he tells us. That the understanding ought not to be allowed to soar above experience. This is literally taken out of the first critique, right? These are the Herrengespenster, right? These are the dangerous thoughts that you can fly off into the heavens, figments of our imagination. You can't let us do that anymore, right? Kant says that the understanding ought not to be allowed to soar above experience, lest the cognitive faculty become a theoretical reason that by itself would beget nothing but mental fancies. That's the Herrengespenster. That's the figments of imagination. Fantasies. So that's the way people read Kant. He's taught us, don't fantasize about what you can't know. And what you can't know is the end itself, and included among the things you can't know is, God, freedom, and immortality. That's all gone. Metaphysics, dead. Now, think for just a moment. This preface began about logic, about how to think. Why is it going on and on about metaphysics? What they got to do with one another? We're coming into that. But they should. Why are we even talking about this? So he says, nothing but mental fantasies. This was the justification of coming from the scientific camp for renouncing speculative thought. So here's what all good Kantians could say. One sense, good Kantians. We can't do metaphysics anymore. That's a dead, inviolable option. Can't go down that road. And he says, in support of this popular doctrine, this is top of page 8, there was added the cry of alarm of modern pedagogy. All right, so it wasn't just Kantians who were doing this. Modern pedagogues teaching did this as well. That the pressing situation of time called for attention to immediate needs, not those metaphysical speculation crap. We don't need to worry about God, freedom, and immortality, and the soul and the world. Forget all that. That justice in the ways of knowledge experience is first. So here's rampant empiricism, right? Everything comes from experience, right? Think Locke. Is first. So for skill in public and private life, exercise and practical education are the essential. They alone is what is required, while theoretical insight is even harmful. So there's the uptake of the exoteric teaching of Kant's philosophy. No metaphysics, can't do it, don't need it. That's good, because we need to be about things that matter more. Practicalities, not speculation about the in itself. But then look what he says. With science and common sense thus working hand in hand. So science is the scientific camp of saying, look, here's what Kant taught us. You can't know the end itself. The common sense is the other sense, the pedagogical side. That says you don't even need to know that stuff. You need to worry about what matters most, the immediate needs of your life. Thus working hand in hand to cause the downfall of metaphysics. The singular spectacle came into view of a cultivated people, a formed people, without a metaphysics. Okay, well, if we can't have it and really don't need it, what's the big deal? Here's what Hegel says. Like a temple richly ornamented in other respects, but without, a holy of holies. Now that's Hegel's image for saying, like you had the temple but didn't have God dwelling in it. That's hollow. Vacuous. A farce. So Hegel's just letting you know, metaphysics has come into ill repute, is entered into a downfall, right. But that's a horrible situation to be in. It's like building a temple without the central object of worship being in that temple. Remember, the Holy of Holies is where God dwells. Israelites. Then look at the next paragraph down. So he goes on about theology and talks about the downfall of metaphysics, what it did to theology, and looks at other things. But let me just drop over that and look down now at the next paragraph, because finally we get to logic. And he says, well, that's what happened to metaphysics. Right? It's been extirpated. We got rid of it. But logic, he says, did not fare quite as badly as metaphysics. So now we finally get to logic. That from logic one learns how to think, so it does have a value, it's pedagogical value, teaches you how to think, which for lack of anything else, that's all it can do, right? Tell you how to think. It's formal, completely and totally formal. Was considered its usefulness and therefore its purpose. Just as if one were to learn how to digest or to move first from the study of anatomy and physiology, which for Hegel is stupid. You don't learn how to digest by reading anatomy books and physiology books. You learn it by doing it. This is a prejudice that has long been put to rest. And in this respect, the spirit of practicality certainly did not intend any better fate for logic than it did for its sister science, metaphysics. That's its sister science. Then look at what he does here, because this is really the term, what he's going to say in the preface. Nevertheless, probably for the sake of a certain formal utility, a place was still allowed for it, logic, among the sciences. It was even retained as a subject of public instruction. So we got rid of metaphysics. Nobody's teaching that. But we'll still teach logic. Critical thinking. That's what we call it today. That's what he's talking about. Formal thinking. However, this better lot concerns only the outer fate, exoteric outer fate, of logic. For its shape and contents remain the same throughout a long inherited tradition, though progressively more diluted and emaciated in the course of the transmission. No traces so far to be detected in it of the new spirit. Here's the problem we started with. Logic hasn't yet been imbued with the new spirit that 25 odd years ago began. We saw what it did in metaphysics, at least its exoteric teaching was get rid of it. That suggests that the esoteric teaching is produce a critical metaphysics. I'm still a Kantian. He says, be detected in no traces so far to be detected in of the new spirit that has awakened in the sciences no less than in the world of actuality. That's a reference back to that first complete transformation. However, once the substantial form of the spirit has reconstituted itself, it is of no avail to want to retain the forms of an earlier culture. They are like withered leaves pushed aside by the new buds already being generated at the roots. And here's the new time is arising, right? The new worlds which we're living in. So he says, also, top of page 9, also in the scientific realm, this ignoring of the universal change is gradually beginning to lose ground. The new ways of thinking are taking place. Well, how do we bring that to bear in logic? Logic is not just a formal discipline. Logic is not just an emaciated form of how we think and the rules for thinking properly, rightly, justly. What more could it be? He says, next paragraph down, the period of fermentation that goes with the beginning of every new creation seems to be past. Here's the new worlds emerging, but it hasn't yet emerged in logic. In its first manifestation, a new creation usually behaves towards the entrenched systemizations of the earlier period with fanatical hostility. So that's why you read Kant as a critic of metaphysics. He's the burgeoning out of this new world, and he's destroying metaphysics. And you think, initially, disaster, he's done them all and they're gone. He says this, principle with fanatical hostility and fear of losing itself in the expansion of the particular. It also shuns the labor that goes with scientific cultivation, and nevertheless in need of it. It grasps at first at an empty formalism. That's where we are right now. We're at an empty formalism. Logic is just something that is the rules for thinking. That is just empty. It doesn't have any content. You got to think. The content all has to come from what you're thinking about. I'm thinking about the table. I'm thinking about my friends. I'm thinking about the world. That's the content. The rules for thinking about that come from logic. That's pure formalism. So where do we get any content that's unique to logic itself? What does that even mean? It says, it grasps at first at empty formalism. The demand for the elaboration and cultivation of the material becomes, at that point, all the more pressing. Here we go. We've got to elaborate the material, the content of logic itself. There is a period in the formation of an epoch in which, just as in the formation of the individual, same language we saw used in the preface of Phenomenology, the foremost concern is the acquisition and reinforcement of the principle in its undeveloped intensity. But the higher demands that such a principle should be made into science. So here's the title of the book. We need a logic. It's a scientific logic, a science of logic. So he says in the next paragraph, now whatever might already have happened to the substance and form of science in other respects, you have it here translated as the science of logic. Literally in German, it's the logical science. So he's just picking up on what he's just talked about. It must become science. Logic must become itself a science. That makes up metaphysics. Whoa, slow down. Did you just tell me that logic is metaphysics? Yes. That's what he's just asserted. That a genuinely scientific logic would also be a metaphysics. A metaphysics that would be the critical metaphysics, that is the esoteric